So Professor Rowe, in your latest book, you highlighted diversity as one of the necessary conditions for successful housing typologies. Could you share with us why is this so, and what are the, how can diversity be achieved?
Yes. As we move forward, I think the, shall we say, the variety of household types or occupants of housing is going to increase, or has increased actually significantly in most OECD countries since about 1990. And therefore, with that increase in diversity of household types, you need accommodations that accommodate them, along with more variation in lifestyle and amenity and that sort of thing that people want as they become a little bit more affluent in the world. So I think it's tied to that. It's a sort of programmatic, it's an architectural response to a programmatic enlargement. The way to deal with it from a physical point of view, of course, is to have a variety of different dwelling unit types obviously in a housing complex, as well as also from an amenity point of view, making sure that there's very close access in terms of proximity to those housing units of non-residential uses. So you can buy a bottle of milk and have a drink, eat at a cafe. So it talks about mixture of uses within a residential complex, not just simply them being housing. In terms of socioeconomic diversity, that's obviously a sort of policy question, and a question that's lies outside of housing per se. But clearly, again, if you're going to entertain a very diverse array of people socioeconomically, you also probably need variety with respect to the units themselves, and also to put them into an environment where they're very comfortable and where any sort of differences among them are mitigated as much as possible.
You have visited some of the examples in Singapore in terms of public housing. So could you share with us what do you think of Singapore's public housing model?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously a lot of progress has been made since I first started to look at this in the 90s. Yeah. When you were trying to sort of just get roofs over people's heads and building the new towns. I mean, Bishon was the sort of that we saw yesterday was a case of that, and I still think it's a very interesting project. But now, for example, Skyview at Dawson is a very recent example, which is quite different. It's almost 50 stories tall. It's kind of vertical neighbourhoods. I think it's the two things that impress me most about that are, in fact, not so much the community gardens, but the idea of this plaza in the front and the way the ground plane is treated in relationship to the housing itself, as well as the units themselves, right? That are quite flexible because they're simply a sort of long box that can be broken up over time and probably modified, which I think is very smart on the part of Woha, the architects who I admire a lot, quite frankly. The Singaporean model is essentially a model where a supply of housing is delivered to a population with, of course, some cognizance of what they want. It's very different than, let's say, an American-style public housing program whereby the support is given to users of housing to go and pick their own houses, so to speak, from amongst those that are available. In other words, an indirect provision through subsidies. So it's a rather specific model. I think it probably needs to broaden out in terms of adopting some other approaches that also require kind of subsidy in a, I wouldn't say an American style, but a style where it's a little bit more indirect, as well as being sort of more mixed with respect to scales. Most of these have been built within a kind of idea of a new town or fairly large scale units. I mean, even Skyview at Dawson, something like 900 units, which is an awful lot of housing in one place. And, obviously it's also responding to the conditions in Singapore, which mean you have to have high density. Otherwise, you're going to run out of land very quickly. So it's a very specific model. I don't think it's necessarily replicable, and I don't think it necessarily should be. And it's very much about the place, Singapore, which is a good thing.
So let's talk a little bit about blue and green infrastructure. You have studied the blue and green infrastructure in various cities all over the world. So why is blue and green infrastructure important in terms of urban livability?
Well, I think it's always a complement to the, as it were, bricks and mortar and concrete side of building. I mean, most blue and green is artificial. It's built by somebody, or shall we say, nurtured by somebody. We don't live in the wilderness in urban circumstances. Let's be clear about that. But it's a necessary complement, I think, for a variety of reasons. One is it's part of, you might say, the aesthetic of the public space. It also performs certain kind of technical functions of shading, of purification of water, let's say, and of air, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a natural complement. And it's found in pretty well all types and styles of housing, ranging from the suburbia of America, where it's very abundant, and even, by the way, in this higher density environment here in Singapore, I think you're getting close to 50% of it's actually greened, which is a substantial quantity, which makes sense again because, you know, Singapore's in the tropics. It's right on the equator. We would expect it to be green, I would think. And it's got a very, very high degree of biodiversity, which is also supported not by the buildings, but by the green bit. And that, of course, we know very well from an ecological point of view is something we need to support. So I think that's the reason why we have the blue-green aspects.
Yeah, you've seen Bishan Park yesterday.
Yeah.
So could you share with us what you think of Singapore's blue-green system?
Oh, I think it's a great untold story about Singapore. If you asked me if I was a reporter, right, and you asked me what's the big story here, I would probably say blue-green, because it's the one that's probably less commonly understood about Singapore. It's where you're very advanced, all the way from the sort of cellular purification of water, the degree of recycling that you do, the kind of loop that you've created, the separation of stormwater from the sewage system, the cleansing aspects of this thing. It's a very, very highly orchestrated undertaking, and it's all kind of like fitted together. I think it started off in Singapore, as elsewhere, by the way, with very strong structural approaches. In other words, to stop flooding, you built a channel and the water flowed away. To move water from one place to another, you built a big pipe and boom, it went through it. Now, in more recent times, Singapore's moved, like in other parts of the world, but probably even in a way more profoundly, to non-structural approaches, where you actually are using the available space between the buildings, let's say, the landscaped area, mimicking the way in which you would like to have a natural response to things like flood events and so on, and making that do the work. Which also leads to rather beautiful environments. I think Bishan is that way, where it's almost entirely vegetated, and you have otter, which is a new contribution, I think, to Singapore and its urban areas. We saw a lot of heron yesterday, for example, and where there's a joint use. In other words, the large expanse of the Bishan Park is there for a flood control point of view, to retain the water before it moves on downstream, to mitigate the peak rise of flooding. So, the downtown doesn't get flooded. It's sort of like held up for a while, and levels off the peak flow. But then, in times in which that's not happening, which is most of the time, it's also used for recreational purposes of a variety of kinds. You can play footy there, you can have a rock concert there, you can walk there, you can do Tai Chi, you can bike, etc. So I think it's a real asset. I think, the only things that I think could be improved are the sort of edges as it confronts the urban circumstances, and sort of moving it into Bishan, for example, so that you get this sense of strong connectedness. But by and large, I think, the blue-green aspect of Singapore is a big story, and one which you should be very proud of, and one that the world needs to know more about what you're doing, because you're doing it very well.